Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining this session. My name's Richard Apps. I'll be chairing this, endeavouring to keep Jason on time. Failed in the first time, so we'll crack the whip on him a bit harder this time. No, I'll crack the whip on you too, Georgina. Okay, so this session we're going to discussing some current work around managing triplets. I'm sure you're all familiar with Jason as chairman of the Best Wool Best Lamb Network. And Georgina, I'm sure many of you know her as well, a producer from Haywood. So they're going to tag team on their experiences, Jason on the research side that's currently happening, and Georgina, her experiences on farm managing her triplet bearing mobs. So with no further ado.
Thank you. Thanks, Apsy. And this project basically exists because of members in Best Wool Best Lamb really wanting to, I suppose, take the next step with lamb survival. We're really focused on working with MLA, Agriculture Victoria and Murdoch Uni to better understand how we can improve the survival of triplet dams and their lambs. And it's absolutely work in progress because the project's only literally recently started this year. And we've got some objectives, if we just flick to the next one, that basically talk about what we want to achieve. And if I give a bit of an overall really brief introduction, Australia has a $6 billion sheep and wool industry. There's $1.1 billion loss every year in profit in lamb loss. That's looking between 30% loss that currently exists and the 10% loss that we can get down to in best practice. This is singles, twins, triplets, the whole lot lumped in, okay? So we've got an over $1 billion loss each year. Now clearly, economically, triplets aren't the biggest issue. Okay, but the reason this project's funded and the reason we're interested in particular is as we've shifted to more non-merino ewe types and also within the merino genotype themselves, we've lifted fecundity. Both merinos and non-merinos, we're getting more triplets. And I suppose it's one thing to wind up our performance, it's another thing to be responsible for the outcomes of that and trying to work on how we can better look after those ewes that we didn't used to have years ago when our flocks weren't as fecund. And we have a lot more of them now that conceive triplets. So it's about responsibility as well as production and profit. So it's basically, there's three phases to the project. A market research phase, which we're in this year, then the next 2 years are all about on-farm trials, basically with a view to try and build a best management practice guide for triplets, which currently does not exist. You can try and engineer one yourself, like someone like Jim McAfee, that'd be pretty good on the Google. You could learn a bit from New Zealand, which farmers like George have done, and I'll put a few slides up from the New Zealand experience, but he'd be cobbling it together through international R&D and a bit of anecdote from some switched-on farmers and trying to come up with a package. What we want to do is, like we've done in merino twins with Lifetime Wool, in the Maternal's project just recently, is to do the same sort of thing and really understand what we can do with triplets. The driver in the market research for different farmers, why they're interested, varies. The seed stock flocks there that we've talked to, their interest is they're keen on having good SG data and knowing how many fetuses were there in the first place and really trying to drive genetic gain in lamb survival. The maternal flocks are saying to us, we've traded off on fleece value, we've got to get really serious about meat production per hectare, and some of our highest profit ewes potentially are the triplets, but we're just not getting the performance out of them. And the merino flocks are saying, well, our big issue in triplets is ewe death. And I'll show you some data on that. Other stimuli have been a small proportion, and the scanners are keen on it and promoting it. Lots more farmers out there. I mean, let's not worry about the pressure on the horizon. Lots more of us are becoming, and already are, really conscious. We're the custodians of our flock. And when we see these ewes and don't understand why they die, and we don't like to see the lamb loss, we want to understand more about that, so that's driven some. And the other one there's a lot more discussion about today is paddock allocation. And at the moment there's very little scanning for triplets. There's only, of the 40 million ewes in Australia, based on surveying work we did last year, not in this project, there's only 26% of the national flock that is scanned for multiples, full stop. What we'll know by the time we get to the next milestone report, pretty much in this project, we'll know a good guide on the number of ewes in the national flock that are actually scanned for triplets. And it'll be a very small proportion. So most people don't know what they've got. There's a mindset that it's probably not worth the hassle and not worth the payoff. So most people just put them, that are scanning, just put them in the multiple group. But what do you know, for the other 75% of Australia's ewes that aren't scanned for multiples, they'll have some triplets too, and they'll be really under pressure. So we're going to look into that. So our focus is to build a protocol for farmers to follow, or a best practice guide. What are the challenges that producers we've engaged with already through our focus groups and surveying to date? What are they telling us? And it's pretty much that the Merino emphasis is they want to get a control of the ewe loss first before they worry about lifting tailing rates of lambs. So we've already collected data with Merino ewe death rates towards 25% in triplets. So it's a big issue when you got that sort of loss. You can't tail a lot of lambs when 25 of every 100 ewes have died with 3 lambs on board before you start. That takes a fair few lambs out of the paddock. So, whereas the maternal people, yes, we've certainly had some issues with ewe loss, but not to the same degree, and they're really focused on improving tailing rates. The core issues that are bubbling to the surface around causes of lamb loss are summarised here. What we'll do in the research phase of this project will work out which are the big ticket items we're going to go after, and what are the interventions we're going to test and their impact on these things. But I'll show you a graph in a minute from previous research on lamb birth weight. Ewe death, the causes around that, the list is long, and we need more understanding on that. I'll draw attention to this one here, which we'll probably try and better define. The farmers call no-show, where they've got these triplet ewes that they feel are just starting the birth process, even though not much is showing. They know they're right on the point because you can look at all those signs that tell you that. And she basically kind of commences the process and dies. And so we're going to have to do some investigation. We've done 6 focus groups here. There's 2 being done this week in New Zealand, and we've got a link to New Zealand in this project. And the 2 up here are more maternals. We've got maternals, mainly maternals, and mainly merinos here. And this one was all merinos. And what you can quickly look at is their best and worst results in lamb loss and in ewe loss. And you can run your eye down there, and we'll talk a bit to George in a minute. But basically, George is one of the best farmers we've come across in this market research phase, and that's why she's going to tell us her story. But she sort of can mark up towards 245% of lambs out of her triplets. But for example, lots of people in their worst experience are flat out marking sort of 150% of lambs out of their triplets. So there's a lot of scope there. What are the things we need to do to exploit that? So this is really not for you to digest, but just to trigger what we've gathered so far is we're saying to farmers, what do you think the critical practices are? Why are they a critical practice? Which aspect do they influence? And what do you currently implement as targets for twins in that guidelines? And what do you think to go for triplets? And what this is do is what we call in this project feeding the top of the funnel. And through the process of this year, gathering evidence, linking that to on-farm outcomes, we'll prioritise which things we investigate next year. Because you'll notice there's a lot of noise. We had farmers even in George's focus group. Some are saying, I only want these triplets on about 1,200 of food. Because what I've noticed, if I put them on 2 tonne, they all live content in one corner of the paddock and they don't spread out and forage. And the moment they're mobbing together because they're content and full of feed, you get huge lamb death because of all of the confusion and mismothering. So it'll be interesting as to where we sit in some of these targets. And the anecdote is quite varied, and that's why we need to do the R&D around things like feed on offer, condition score, lambing density. So repeating a similar design to what we did in twins that's talked about here today, so on, a whole series of things. So I don't want to absorb too much time now other than quickly saying here's the birth weight to survival outcome out of the maternals project. We know that at the same birth weight they survive at 20 to 30% less than the twins at the same birth weight. So birth weight's critical, but an example of one of the trade-offs is you feed the ewe really heavy to drive birth weight, you can end up with an overweight ewe that's compromised at the point of lambing as far as her mobility and ability to continue to forage. So there's a balancing act, and the conclusion of a lot of maternal farmers has already been, don't go too hard feeding these triplets, like perhaps lamb them down around the twin condition score or even a bit less. Make sure they're fit, not fat, is the terminology we use. But the merino farmers can't play that card because birth weight is absolutely critical. So they've got a challenge here as to how we get the nutrition in to get the birth weight, but still have a mobile ewe. And I think that's been really tied up in some of the ewe loss. So if I quickly touch upon, I'll try and do this in 1 minute, some of the New Zealand stuff. They've got some guidelines on condition score, 3 to 3.5. From our discussion so far with farmers in Australia, they wouldn't be advocating out that far. They'd be sort of talking 3.3 maximums. Really good quality pastures, but again, interestingly, minimum food covers that aren't extreme. So it'll be interesting to understand what's going on there. But these will be high quality pastures that are growing quickly. Okay? So it's not that you got them on 1200 a foo and they're drilling it into the ground, like this one paddock that George will talk about, where she stocked it, didn't grow quick enough, not the quality of pasture, you get ewe death. So it's a balancing act. Shearing in mid-pregnancy to manipulate appetites, one of the things they've done a lot of work in New Zealand to really drive birth weight. So click on to another couple of the slides. Paul Kenyon contributed all this. One of the things they've done a lot of work with is alternative herbages. And if you look at the next picture, they've repeated this trial for years with multiple bearing ewes allocated to these paddocks basically at the point of lambing, where instead of having them in high quality ryegrass pastures in their comparison, they put them on these chicory alternative herbage. They've used lucerne, other things. And what their work shows over years of research is an extra 7 to 8 kilos of lamb weaned per multiple bearing ewe allocated to that, driven by survival and lamb growth rate. So that's interesting. How that could fit in here, who knows? They've got an industry where farmers are pretty keen on lamb survival, and their genetic analysis has had genetic information on lamb survival for years. It's about to come for us when we break NLW into the component traits. A lot more scanning, a lot more awareness, and a lot more autopsying being done on individual farms. And so what are some of the things the farmers are saying are critical in New Zealand? Basically link your feed demand and your supply together so the feed's growing when you're lambing. Basic fundamentals. Get them on some of the flatter country. They've had issues with some of the steeper country, flatter and north-facing and sheltered blocks. I've already talked about this, and good animal health strategies, basically. So, I want to hand over to George. I think that's my last slide. Other than to say, you can click on. Yep, other than to say that at the end of this workshop or conference, you'll all be sent an email. And those producers that would like to be part of what we're doing this year in this project, which is simply understanding if you've scanned for triplets, what percentage have you got on board out of your scanning rate for different ewe types and different times of lambing, and then we'll follow you up and also anonymously collect and build understanding around your ewe and lamb loss, because we want to get a picture of the situation, then use that to inform the trial phase, and then the third and final phase will be an extension package in 2 or 3 years' time. So, George.
Okay, well, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of my farming business, and then I'll discuss what decisions scanning has led us on for the last 20 years with triplet management. So Maneroo is a family farming business, although I'm the only family member working in it at the moment, and I've got one full-time staff member. I've got 2 girls, they're both in their mid-20s, both very handy on the farm, but they both have law degrees with the possibility of transitioning onto farm in the next couple of years. I firmly believe that farmers need an education, and that's why I've insisted that they have a tertiary education. Didn't care what field they went into, and I wanted them to experience the corporate world before returning to farming, because as farmers I think we've got to get smarter at what we do to retain that social licence that is becoming a real issue at the moment. Maneroo is located in the far southwest of Victoria in a 40-inch rainfall zone, and yes, we're humming along very well at the moment, and I apologise to anyone who's not getting rain, because if you're not getting rain it means we're drier than normal and it's a better season. We are surrounded by bush, which you can see out the back there. We run 3,000 self-replacing composite adult ewes and calve 350 self-replacing breeder cows. We take our steer portion through to feedlot entry weight. So in spring we're running about 20,000 DSE. So the decision to run what we run, and it's similar to what we've already heard this morning and anyone who was here yesterday, it's based upon our environmental conditions. We lamb and calve to fit around the spring flush, which for us the grass starts growing in about September. That helps us get the young stock off to a good start. And one year when we had a hiccup with rams, we actually lambed earlier, or we had to split the lambing, and the earlier lambs were no better weights than, because they'd had the check over that midwinter wet time, than the later lambing lambs. And our genetics are also selected around our environment. There's no point trying to run a merino ewe in a 40-inch rainfall, as they just don't have the resilience to do it. And because we don't have the wool value in our system, we need to keep a good focus on getting as much red meat as we can. We lamb down ewe lambs and we calve heifers as 2-year-olds, and if they don't do that, they don't remain in the herd. So we wet dry, any wet dries go, all that sort of thing. So we started scanning in 1996, only wet and dry to start with, before progressing to single and multiples, and then multiples to twins and triplets. And the more you collect data, you find the more you want to find out. All scanned dry ewes from 2 years of age and over no longer remain on the farm. And I've found the more data you collect, the more questions and management decisions come from it. So as Jace pointed out, I used to think that triplet bearing ewes were a pain. We'd run them just as multiples or in one big mob out the back, expecting low survivability out of them. And I even reduced my ram selection criteria for the number of lambs weaned because of the number of scanned triplets we were starting to get, because one of my selection criteria was prior to that number of lambs weaned. But from the data I was collecting, and in the juggle of getting animals into paddocks and then putting small mobs of various leftover paddocks, we started to find that some paddocks perform better with triplets. So it started to make us question, well, why is that? The other thing against doing it was, the talk was, triplet lambs are always inferior. But once you start collecting data, you actually find that that's not necessarily the case. So by lambing small numbers of triplet-bearing ewes, making sure they're well fed, and remembering that they can't physically eat enough in the last stages of pregnancy, ensuring they had shelter, feed on offer, we were finding reasonable survivability is possible. So that then got me thinking, if we could run less ewes, we would have less maintenance costs and get the same amount of lambs. And we used to run 4,000 adult ewes, we now run 3,000. Then I ran into someone in the pig industry and quizzed them how they became more efficient. And one of the things that they did was increase their litter size from 10 to 12 to 16 to 18. So they may have other advantages that come into play, like housing and stuff like that, but that also, as we know, has animal welfare issues. So it then made me think, how can we replicate this on farm? So the issues I was grappling with, efficiency, how can we get more from less? And at about that time, in the early 2000s, there was signals coming from the UK about animal welfare and the consumer's perception of animal welfare. So that has caught up to us now in Australia, and this is one reason why you need to be forever looking at what emerging issues are overseas, and as farmers we need to be scanning that horizon and thinking, okay, where do we need to move to in the future? And that has been one of my mantras the whole way through, but I need all of you to do that as well. So as Anna said this morning, we can't bury our head in the sand. We need to be on the front foot with animal welfare. We also need to be open and transparent to our consumer and show what we're trying to do to improve the problems that we have. I also now comfortably budget on 200% out of triplets to use paddocked. So Looking after ewes takes planning, and the first step in this process is scanning. The earlier you can identify triplet ewes, the earlier you can start looking after them. We rotationally graze, so scanning actually becomes a pain in the neck because we complicate it by dividing the flock into singles, twins and triplets. The dries get sold, and then we start prioritising the ewes with the triplets the first priority, and so on. We still identify earlies and lates because we put them into their lambing paddocks as such, and we used to run them separately, but it just got too complicated and too hard to manage feeds. There weren't enough paddocks, all those sort of issues. We all know what a juggling act it is, and yeah, I've got to try and simplify it, especially when you've got staff. So scanning percentage, as you can see from this slide, triplet percentages have been between 9 and 23%. Variances on these figures are seasonal, such in 2016 when we actually were in containment feeding until mating. I took my eye off the ball, I wasn't paying enough attention, and the condition scores of the ewes at mating was not good enough. So that attention to detail is extremely important. The other figures are also a bit skewed because we've taken on quite a few on-farm trials that involve AI and stuff like that, and in our type of ewe, AI actually reduces the conception rate. But as you can see, we generally have between 300 and 800 triplet-bearing ewes. These are all rotationally grazed until pre-lambing, when they are then set stocked. And sometimes at Maneroo, they can be in mud. But the beauty about rotationally grazing is every few days they get clean pasture to go onto. And because the rainfall's so high, of course, it cleans the paddocks that they come out of. So what has worked for us? Most paddocks now have a shelter belt around them. When I first went home on farm and I did a master's, part of my business plan was identifying the fact that shelter was one of the biggest survivability factors. So, as I said, most paddocks have a shelter belt around them now. Aspect is also an issue, and I'm just going to show you this paddock here. This was actually a poor performing paddock, and part of that was the fact that although it had a plantation on the western side, the southern side and the eastern side, there was that hill, and all the ewes went up there to lamb down. So we took a hit there. So you learn. You know, you think everything's right and then it proves you wrong. Feed on offer and quality is important, and prioritising mobs around that. Paddock size is important. You don't want too big a paddock. Sheep are actually very social animals, and they have their own sort of social areas and that sort of thing, and that's why we also want over-lambing. We try to keep them set stocked if we can. Parasite control in triplet-bearing ewes is extremely important, so we actually capsule them so we don't have to worry about that aspect. And minimal disturbance is really important, and I just want you to have a look at mill paddock last year. Our percentage to lambs marked to ewes paddock was 137%. Now, I wanted to put the worst up here just so you could see that. Now, the problem with that paddock was it had great shelter, it had great feed on offer, but it was the first paddock that we drive into when we go out of the yard. So there was a huge disturbance in that paddock, and that was the result that we got from it. So I just thought it was really important to show you the bad figures with the good. We try not to have more than 50 triplet-bearing ewes in a paddock. Sometimes they have to go under cattle. We tag all our calves at birth, so that means that there will be disturbance in the lamb, when the lamb and ewe are bonding. So that's not ideal, but if we do have to put cattle over the top of them, we actually make sure it's older cattle because younger cattle are very inquisitive. Jason asked me why the ewe deaths was so high in Spring East. 2006, I think we had most of our rainfall from June on, and we had over 40 inches that year. So it was once again underwater, and we had nowhere to move the ewes, so they ran out of feed in that paddock. So that was exactly what that was about. So last year's experience, we had 160 mils of rain in September. As I said, we lambed down in September. That's what the research at the PVI at Hamilton has shown, that there's less wind in September, there's rain starting to ease off, temperatures are starting to warm up. 9 times out of 10 it works. Last year it didn't. And some of those figures from 2017 reflect that. You know, even koala usually is a very good triplet paddock, but I would say that was exposure. The first 2 weeks were just a disaster. I was just shutting my eyes, just, I suppose, being that ostrich. So in our business, I can't tell you, measure is your most important thing, and analysing that data. Scanning allows us to plan and select and prioritise. We're looking for the most efficient ewe, so not only that she raises multiples, but they're good weights year after year. Easy care and highly efficient at feed conversion. And I just wanted, especially for us that we have very little wool value, we're better off getting 2 to 3 lambs, 25 to 30 kilos, than that actually genetically should perform well to slaughter weight. They're just a little bit behind when they start, than an 80 kilo ewe weaning one 30 to 40 kilo lamb. So moving forward, I want to analyse year on year triplets scanning. We've now got 3 years of NLIS tags in ewes, so we've got scanning data from last year for those ewes, and we'll get more this year because we scan next week. And we want to follow the ewes through, but also would like to start correlating data and matching lambs to ewes, so I can work out how much they do in that space as well. But at the moment, the tags are going to cost me $9,000, so I'm just, wavering there, trying to find someone to help me do it.
Authorised by Victorian Government, 1 Treasury Place, Melbourne.